Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Outdoor adventures often come with a side of itch. That's why you need Sarna Calm and Cool. Whether you're dealing with bug bites from an adventurous hike or skin irritations from an unexpected encounter with poison ivy, Sarna Calm and Cool provides the soothing care your skin needs. Sarna Calm and Cool lotion relieves itch and pain from insect bites, sunburn, and poison ivy with 1% permoxine hydrochloride and 0.5% menthol. Did you know Sarna is the #1 dermatologist recommended topical anti-itch brand? Learn more at sarnalotion.com today.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to BattleWalks. I'm battlefield historian Matt McLachlan, and once again we're going to be walking a quite extraordinary European battlefield. Joining me as always is my partner in crime, it's Pete Smith. Pete, it's going to be a good walk today.
Yep, it is. Hi, Matt.
So we're heading back to the Somme, and a battlefield that I think is probably one of the most underrated Australian battlefields of the entire First World War. It's the battlefield of Dernancourt. Now, most people would not have heard of the battlefield of Dernancourt. Perhaps if you live in Adelaide, you would be aware that there's a suburb called Dernancourt, as they call it down there in Adelaide. But that's really the only reference I've seen to this battle, yet it's a really important one. And as far as 1918 goes, it was one of the most important actions the Australians fought in.
It was indeed, and I agree. It's not one that even when you're guiding on the battlefield that we go to, it doesn't fit readily into the route that we normally drive. We have a set route that we follow, and Dernancourt kind of is in between 2 of the roads, and all we normally do is whistle past it and point it out, and yet it is a very important action.
Well, why don't you give us the summary, mate? Let's hear one of those excellent Pete Smith 2-minute potted histories. Tell us why the Battle of Dernancourt is so important.
Okay, well, it's important of where it is in the timeline. So we're in 1918. We're just close to the town of Albert, and it's towards the end of this enormous drive by the Germans, the Spring Offensive, the Michael Offensive, where they're attempting to break through and get to Amiens and then the coast. They've been slowed down because of hitting Albert, the town itself, and oddly, what slowed down this German drive is the fact that they're overrunning supply depots and where there's beer and chocolate and stores, and in fact they're going on a binge because the German army hasn't got a lot of food. There's not a lot of food about in the German army. There's certainly not a lot of food in Germany, and so to suddenly hit these supply depots you'd think they'd be really chuffed, but actually it slightly demoralised them. Not more than slightly, it demoralises them because they'd been told that we were almost starving as well, that the Empire troops were not being supplied because of the German submarines taking out the shipping coming from America, and that it meant that there was a lack of food in our army as well, in the British Army, the Empire's forces. It's not true, and obviously this is where they realise that it's not true as they binge on the chocolate and beer. So once they'd actually got through Albert and to the far side of Albert, we get to this little town of Dernancourt. Now, I have to have a talk about how are we going to stop this advance. Well, there were supposedly blocking positions that had been dug in the past, that if the Germans had broken through, which they have done, our frontline positions, then we were going to stop them at various stopping points. And this is one of the stopping points. The unfortunate thing is that the stopping point has basically been filled in by the farmers, the trenches that had been pre-dug to attempt to stop any German breakthrough. The farmers who have been allowed back onto the land thought, well, this trench isn't needed any longer, I'm going to start filling it in. So a lot of the positions that should have been built to try and stop the German advance are not there. And so it means that we're trying to ad hocly hold the Germans in various places. So Dernancourt becomes one of those places. How did the Australians get involved in Dernancourt? Well, the Australians were actually still across in Belgium and had been slowly moving across to the Somme battlefield again from Belgium. And there's a rush, there's suddenly a realisation that there's actually a gap in the line, that there's nobody defending the bit at Dernancourt, and Dernancourt sits almost between two rivers. We have the River Somme and the River Ancre. It's actually sitting on the River Ancre, but effectively between two rivers, and there was nobody there holding that line. So Australian divisions, two of them are rushed in, the 3rd Division and the 4th Division. And it's the 4th Division that we're going to be talking about, who are moved in at Dernancourt to try and stop the advance. The date is actually the 28th of March for the first battle, because there are two battles, 28th of March and the 5th of April. We generally speaking just call it the Battle of Dernancourt, and it covers both of those dates.
So the thing that I think is so astonishing about this, Pete, is that after this huge battle, which we will describe in detail as we walk around the battlefield, this was actually the largest attack Australians faced during the entire First World War, wasn't it?
It's extraordinary. I mean, they're facing, first of all, on the first battle, 2 divisions, and they hold. And then they're facing 3 divisions where we actually lose our frontline positions. And more about that as we follow the route of the attack. But yeah, it's an enormous weight of German manpower. It is those, I suppose, what had been seen by the British Army in 1914. Ranks and ranks of Germans moving forward and actually becoming a very good target for the Lewis gunners and the machine gunners. So not seen really since 1914, and certainly probably never seen by the Australian troops before, rank and rank of Germans advancing towards them.
Before we start walking the battlefield, Pete, what I should say is I absolutely love this battlefield because unlike many of the Western Front battlefields, which today are just flat farm fields, this one is laid out in front of you. It's an interesting piece of ground. The Australian War Memorial did an amazing diorama depicting this battlefield, and you can see those elements that are still there, the railway embankment, the quarry, the slope down which the Australians advanced. There are features here that sit very neatly with the history. So it's one of those battlefields you can walk and get a very good feeling of what the fighting was like.
It is indeed. We're going to be walking from the Germans' perspective, so we're going to be on the railway embankment or just beneath it. There's a bridge there, so we're going to be below the bridge, looking up to the Australian positions. In fact, they were also on the embankment on one side, the Germans were on the other. And from those positions, you can see the whole of the battlefield, right up to the top of the ridge. That is the battlefield, effectively. So it is a superb battlefield to walk.
Well, let's begin that walk. Where are we going to start, Pete?
Right, so we'll start underneath this railway embankment, the bridge that goes underneath it. Behind us is the village, so everything is behind us. The whole village of Dernancourt is behind us, and it's in German hands. So the Germans have taken the village, they're living within the cellars and the buildings, and utterly bizarrely, there are reports from Australians who are observing the Germans moving and seeing that there are villagers still there, elderly people. There are still elderly people who are within the village who did not run away when the Germans started advancing. They stayed in their village. So the Germans are in the village, and they're behind this embankment, so it's protecting them. We are on the other side of the embankment, and effectively the pressure is going to build and build and build until the Germans try to come over the railway embankment. On the other side of the embankment, so if we walk through the railway bridge and look in front of us, we can see several important things. We can see a cemetery, a military cemetery, and a civil cemetery. They are side by side. And then the ground rises in a convex slope. In other words, it gets steeper as you walk into the slope, and there were trenches on the top of that slope as well, on top of the ridge. So we're looking at the whole battlefield. We can see the remnants of the quarry on our right. We can see a little bit of a quarry on the left near the railway line. So it's all there in front of us. And that's the view that the Germans are going to get as they climb over the embankment on the morning, on the dawn of the 28th of March, in their first attempt to force the Australians back.
I love the accounts of this attack on the 28th of March because it just really puts you in that front line. So if we imagine Australians spread out in posts along this railway embankment, and then tell us about the noise of the Germans approaching in this dark, foggy pre-dawn light.
Yeah, well, there's several reports, and there's a chap here that's going to be awarded the Victoria Cross for the fighting here, Stanley McDougall, a sergeant in the 47th Battalion. Better just name the two battalions fighting here. The 47th Battalion and the 48th are fighting alongside the 19th, a British battalion, the Northumberland Fusiliers, 19th Battalion of the Northumberland Fusiliers. Now, they're on the side of the railway embankment, and they can hear this noise as the Germans approach. They can hear their bayonets banging on their spades, their shovels, which are alongside, they're fastened side by side on their hips. So it's this slapping noise, and they know exactly what it is. And they start, I suppose, sticking their heads up. It's dark. This is going to be a dawn attack, and waiting for them to crest the rise, because they have to come over the embankment. So this is a fairly steep, high embankment, and so they're waiting for them to crest the rise, and they can hear the noise as they're approaching.
It's fascinating to think that of what it must have been like in the dark to hear that sound, to know exactly what it meant. It must have been absolutely terrifying for the men on the embankment. And we should say as well that the Australians were not occupying this railway embankment in one long, continuous line of men. A number of small posts with Lewis guns and other infantrymen, because the Australian numbers were so thin that they couldn't form a cohesive line along the railway embankment, could they?
Yeah, there were two issues, I suppose. And the first one is, this is not trenches. This is not, we have this mental kind of imagery of the First World War and the trenches and the barbed wire. Well, here, this is not, because this is us building ad hoc positions to try and stop the Germans. So there's nothing linking the front line, these men that are fighting on the embankment, to the reserve positions. And then even further back, there's something called Pioneer Trench, which is over the crest, on the next crest, really. So it is the difficulty is in moving men backwards and forwards. There's a difficulty in communication, and so really the guys in the front line on these banks are fairly much exposed and fighting independently.
So tell us this incredible story as the Germans came over this railway embankment and the Australians faced them in the foggy morning.
Well, somebody's got to do something. It's like all attacks. You're almost frozen as they watch them climbing over. And this one guy, this Sergeant Stanley McDougall, realised that some of the guys would probably be dozing. Some of them may not be aware of what's going on, and he had to make them aware. And so he grabs a couple of guys, and they start running along the embankment, screaming and shouting. They're coming over the embankment. He's with a Lewis gunner, and the Lewis gunner is hit. And he grabs the Lewis gun. He's not been trained in a Lewis gun to any extent. He would have a basic working knowledge of it, but he's certainly not a Lewis gunner. And he opens fire with his Lewis gun and starts spraying it like a hose pipe along the top of the embankment as he's running along that embankment himself, and clearing the Germans off it. Those Germans that had already got over the embankment found themselves to the left of him and in difficulty, because he's now clearing the top of the embankment single-handedly. And so all the other men wake up and open fire, and eventually the attack is very easily. That's probably not to the men that were there, but the Germans are turned around. They're either killed, captured, or forced back over the embankment. The men climb up. Very unusual, this. The men climb up and stand in the open, hosing down with other Lewis guns and machine gunners and individual riflemen, firing down on the Germans as they try to withdraw back through the village. So it's an amazing success with limited numbers against overwhelming, as we said, that here we have two divisions basically facing 3 or 4 battalions.
He's an extraordinary character, Stan McDougall. I always like reading about him. There was some controversy over Charles Bean's depiction of him in the official history, because there's a couple of different versions of what Stan McDougall actually got up to, and it seemed that when Bean spoke to him, he wasn't particularly impressed with McDougall as a forthcoming chap, and so told the story in a fairly subdued manner. But I think one of the great Victoria Cross actions, it was really a perfect example of one man just seizing control of the situation, rallying everyone around him, being everywhere, doing everything, and a well-earned Victoria Cross.
I like the comment that he's supposed to have said that when he picked up the Lewis gun, he'd always wanted to have a go with one of these, because apparently he'd never fired one in anger before. So I just have this picture of him picking it up and thinking, oh yeah, this is great. No, this is the right weapon to have. But anyway, yeah, it was a truly well-earned Victoria Cross.
The Aussies who fought there on March 28 must have thought that they'd done great work stopping the Germans, but little did they realise that their work was just beginning, because describe what happened in early April.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the same two battalions. So even though battalions would have been rotated normally, it's still holding that section of line. It's still going to be the 47th and the 48th Battalion who will be holding the line. So literally a week later, on the 5th of April, the Germans are going to attempt it again. Interestingly, there's another battalion that's there that is even in the official history, is not talked about a great deal, just mentioned, but the 4th Pioneer Battalion was also there, and they were actually trying to attempt to dig holes through the top of the embankment so that machine guns could fire through the embankment, and they were actually in the act of digging those holes when the attack came in on the 5th of April. So they were actually there to assist, and it's actually the first time that the 4th Pioneer Battalion had actually been used as infantry. They are normally a Pioneer Battalion is normally used for digging and road work and frontline fortifications, and that's what they're trained for, to be able to pick up their rifles and use them if necessary. So they actually can act as an infantry battalion, but this was the first time that they'd been asked to do so, and they had problems. They were overwhelmed, as was everybody really that was in on the railway embankments. The complete right side of the 47th Battalion was overrun, along with the 4th Pioneers who were working there as well. The big problem is, how do you disengage? If you're being overrun by a weight of numbers, and that's what's going on, it's the weight of numbers of 3 divisions of Germans coming over that, not all obviously exactly at the same time, but ongoing, coming over the embankment and forcing the men back. How on earth do you disengage? And where do you get to? Well, you've got to run across this sloping landscape, this sloping ground, through the remnants, interestingly, of a casualty clearance station that was still there. It had not, they'd evacuated the casualties when the Germans first approached, but the buildings were still there, the tents and the hut and some of the huts. So they had to run through these and try and get up the slope, being covered by the men in the reserve trenches that were higher up. But it was very different to the first attack. The Germans had sorted it. They realised that all they needed were more men, and that's the one thing they had a lot of at that time, a lot of men to throw against them.
So let's walk in the footsteps of those attacking German troops, and it's something I love to do when I go to Dernancourt, is to walk through under the bridge in the railway embankment and just picture that you're a German charging up that slope early in the morning of the 5th of April.
Yep, and charging up that slope they did. Now, the good thing from the defensive positions was the amount of mortar fire that was coming down. They had the Stokes mortar, this very light mortar, run by the infantry battalions, and the guys that were further up on the slope in the reserve trenches were able to bring down an enormous weight of mortar fire. In fact, one of the mortars fired all of its rounds, 370 rounds. It fired every one at the Germans, and so the amount of firepower from these mortars would have assisted in the half light. Now, what I should say is what is also assisting the Germans at this time is the fact that this is a very, very misty morning. So it's early morning and it's misty, and the visibility was almost nil. And that leads to a problem, is that normally what you do, you would fire an SOS rocket. So if you're in the frontline soldier being overrun, you fire an SOS rocket that would bring down artillery fire to protect you almost on your own frontline trenches. Used throughout history once artillery becomes a formidable weapon. And so that's what would normally happen. But they fired their rockets. No result. The artillery men who were further back, about 3 miles or 4 miles further back, could not see the rockets. So they didn't bring down any supporting artillery fire. So that was one of the big issues, is it's down to the mortars to do the job and the machine gunners to try and slow down the German advance as they're forcing us back up these positions. The attack was so quick and so overwhelming that actually there was a group of machine gunners who were in one of the quarries. So this is just a quarry cut into the bank, and it gave them some element of fire. They never even got their guns into action. They were overrun before they could get their guns into action. So we're going to walk along the road, having left the cutting, going through the embankments, and we're going to walk up towards the quarry where the quarry is, where these machine gunners were actually overrun. And on the left-hand side, as we walk up, we're going to go past a cemetery. I'll talk about the cemetery at the end because it's just it's not really relevant to the fighting, but it's an interesting point because the cemetery would have been there. The cemetery had been created by the casualty clearing stations that were based there, so there was a cemetery actually, both civil and military. So we walk past it up the slope. So this is climbing up the slope, and we eventually get to the quarry. Now this is a good place to start to look back behind you, and you will see the view that the Australian machine gunners and mortarmen would have had before they also had to abandon their positions because they will be forced further back. But this is the positions that that stopped the German advance in its tracks here by the number of casualties. The casualties of the Germans were, we don't know exactly how many, because of course the Germans held the ground, and so they were able to evacuate their wounded and dead at the end of this action. But this is as far as they will really get. They will go a little further and then they'll be forced back. So from this position we can look back and we get a really good view of the cemetery and also of the railway arch and this embankment. So it's a little bit like looking at the diorama at the War Memorial here. This is the start of the view that we'll see, and you can see how important this embankment will be because the Germans can hide behind it, the village is behind it, but once they're over it, then they are in a killing field. So long as we can keep machine guns and mortars firing at them, then they are in a killing field.
That walk up to the quarry, Pete, is always a very emotional one, I find. It's very atmospheric because the road is slightly sunken. As you walk up, you can look back behind you. It's really easy to put yourself in the shoes of those Germans. And obviously coming up the slope, they were looking for any cover they could get. And so a lot of the Germans who charged up that slope came up and used the road for cover. And then when you get up to the quarry, depending on what's going on with the quarry, it's quite overgrown. There's a wood behind it, which is in private hands, which you shouldn't go into. But depending on what's happening, the state of the quarry, you could do a bit of exploring there as well. And you can picture what it must have been like for those poor Aussie machine gunners who were setting up their machine guns in that quarry and didn't realise that the Germans were overrunning them until shots started coming at them from behind. It must have been terrifying.
Yeah, indeed. There was quite a number of men that were actually captured here as well, and sadly, most of those that died here would not be recovered until the end of almost the end of the war, as the Germans fall back in the last 100 days of the fighting. So there's not an awful lot of men who were not able to be identified. But it's a fantastic feeling to look back down, and like all of these battlefields, you can walk into the field and you can pick up the bits of shrapnel still and steel that's in amongst the plough lines. Obviously, when you can, not if the seeds are in. The farmers don't like it if you're walking there when the seeds are in. But it's as we said at the beginning of the podcast, it's a great one because it's so visual. You can look at it from the Australian perspective, you can look at it from the German perspective, and all the time you are looking at almost the entire battlefield. The one thing I should say is, to our left, when we look to the left, so we're looking down towards the railway embankment, but if we look to our left, we can see the Basilica of Albert. So we realise how close we are. Very famous basilica in Albert. It's got the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus held out to the sky. And of course, it had become a very important point to everybody fighting in this area and living in this area when the Germans had been forced back, because she dangled over the town at 90 degrees. So it's something that perhaps we'll talk about in a further podcast when we're talking about Albert. So it is a very famous icon and remembered by most people who had fought in the area. Now, sadly, at this point, it has also been knocked down. We can still see it because the stubby tower is there, but the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus have gone. They've been actually hit by our shells. So it's British shells that will eventually knock her down. But you can get the gist of where Albert is because you can see her on the left-hand side.
There's an interesting story about a couple of the machine gunners that were in the quarry where we're standing right now that I just wanted to share with listeners because it's quite fascinating. And there were two Aussies in the quarry at the time the Germans overran them, Corporal Charles Lane and Private Rinhold Rushpla of the 29th Machine Gun Company. And they were, I think, effectively the first Australians to enter Dernancourt village for a very long time because they did so as prisoners as the Germans overran them and took them prisoner. They were captured, and it was a fascinating account of what happened to them. They were marched down the slope by the Germans. As you said, the most harrowing part of the journey was dodging the Australian artillery fire that was coming down. There was just such a weight of artillery fire. But they managed with a bunch of other prisoners to get down to the village of Dernancourt, accompanied obviously at the point of the bayonet by the Germans. And then they described how they were lined up there and a German officer came along who spoke English and he asked them who they were. And when one Australian soldier in their group said, "We're the Australians," and apparently gave him a bit of a lip, the German took out his revolver and shot the Australian dead on the spot. And the feeling was that he remembered the Australians from earlier battles in 1916 and wasn't too keen on seeing a bunch of Australians in his lines again. But then these two soldiers were marched back to a prison camp at Bray, another Somme village not too far away, which would be the scene of heavy fighting later in 1918. And extraordinarily, they were in a makeshift barbed wire cage, and an Allied shell landed and blew a hole in the cage. And they ran for it. They scarpered. They got through the German lines and then had a harrowing journey back across the German lines and back into the Australian lines, where they were almost shot by an Australian sentry as they tried to get back to the lines. But eventually they did make it back to the Australian lines and continued fighting for the rest of the war. And both of them survived the war, which I think is just an extraordinary story. So for 2 days, they were prisoners of the Germans, but managed to carry on and fought until the end of the war. Just an extraordinary story.
I love these little stories. I mean, there are so many little stories like that, and they all need telling. But that's extraordinary. And I mean, and you can imagine with the confusion of the movement and also half light and the luck that you need as well, and a massive element of luck to get back to your own lines. Yeah, great story.
They also described how when they were in the village of Dernancourt, one of them was lightly wounded, and he was tended by a German surgeon who took care of him and the German wounded around him as well. And then a shell struck the building and took the head of the doctor clean off as he was tending to his wounds. So, again, I always think about the story of war to me, Pete, is these personal stories. What was it like for the blokes that were there? And you think about these two guys and what did they live with for the rest of their lives, having been through, even just on this couple of days, what a harrowing experience. And it was probably something that was standard for most men in the line every day of their lives. They're in the war.
I would recommend that if you want to try and just pick up on some of these stories, then one of the places to go to, there are lots of places you can go to learn the stories, but the Australian Red Cross Missing Inquiry Bureau files, a bit of a mouthful, but they are full of first-hand accounts of what happened to individuals on the battlefield. And certainly when I did some research a few years ago about the 4th Pioneer Battalion fighting here, there was just some extraordinary stories of what had happened to individuals on the battlefield. So yeah, I highly recommend the Red Cross files if you have time to go. But they're all online, so you can pick them up quite easily.
That's on the Australian War Memorial website. There's accounts of more than 30,000 soldiers who were wounded or killed during the First World War, and basically inquiry files, committees set up to try and determine what had happened to men who went missing on the battlefield. So some extraordinary and heart-wrenching stories that are found in those files. But so back to Dernancourt. We're standing at the quarry. Explore the quarry if you can. If it's not too overgrown, it's worth getting down there and having a look. There's always shells and things lying around that the farmer has gathered up. But let's leave the quarry now, Pete, and walk actually across the battlefield. We're going to turn right in front of the quarry and walk along a farm track, walk across the battlefield. We're parallel now to the railway embankment, although probably a kilometre or more removed from it. And again, as you walk along this slope, you get a fantastic perspective. This is probably an area where one of the Australian trenches was. It's round about this area where this track is. And again, you just get this extraordinary view down that slope to where you can imagine literally thousands, tens of thousands of Germans streaming up that slope in the foggy morning.
I think that's a great image to think about, but I always have a more terrifying image, and it's those Australians who have survived the initial rush of the Germans over the embankment, scrambling up towards you, trying to get back into their reserve positions. I mean, that must have been just a terrible time to try and get away from the front line up that slope. And many did. Almost half of the 47th Battalion got away, so they were able to get up that slope and to the reserve positions where they carried on fighting until they're then forced out of those positions again, further up the slope and onto almost a plateau. And just beyond the plateau, they had the final positions that was Pioneer Trench, called Pioneer Trench, and that's where they will hold the Germans, and that's where the counterattack will come from as well.
As we walk further along this road, Pete, up sort of to our diagonal left is another quarry, which is up on the main road, and there's not much to see there now. It's really just a bank, so it's not worth diverting from the track to go and see it, but there's one extraordinary story there that after the great counterattack where the Australians took back these German positions, which we're going to discuss in a moment, as they came through, they found an isolated grave of an Australian soldier who'd been buried by the Germans, and a rough cross over his grave, and written in indelible pencil on the cross was, "Here lies a brave English soldier," written in English. And the Germans, of course, referred to all of the British soldiers as English soldiers, whether they were Australian or New Zealand, Canadian, or indeed from England. But the Germans had buried a soldier there and written on his cross in English, "Here lies a brave English warrior." Now, you just imagine with, honour and dread what that bloke went through. Probably a Lewis gunner left behind and who fought so bravely before he was killed that the Germans decided to honour him after they'd finished him off. He fought so bravely that they decided to bury him and honour him with a headstone written in English. I just shudder to think what that man must have gone through in the last moments of his life.
I think there's that point, and of course, utter terror and sadly the ending of his life. But I also like to think about the Germans, that they actually went to the effort to bury them, as they did an awful lot of the Australians who will be killed on this battlefield, because it wouldn't have been easy. One of the things that I often make a point of is you don't risk the living to bury the dead, and especially if the dead happens to be your enemy. But on these fields, it appears that the Germans went to a big effort to bury as many of the men as they possibly could, because they're going to be exhumed by the exhumation parties after the war, and quite a few have markers on their graves. So the Germans had hammered in, even if they hadn't written anything on it on the marker, but they'd actually marked where they were actually burying them, which is also unusual because you don't do that if you haven't got time. But they obviously felt in this action that they wanted to, and so a lot of the graves of multiple men sometimes were marked.
A lot of this story we hear about warfare with, comrade amongst enemies, comradeship amongst enemies, I think it's a little bit overblown. But there are examples like this one where it does seem that the Germans were quite impressed with the bravery and the tenacity of the Australians they were facing. Just extraordinary stuff. We're going to keep walking along the path and then take a right turn. Now we're heading back down the slope towards the railway embankment. Let's talk about this amazing, this counterattack that should be better known than it is, Pete.
Well, and again, we don't really. Again, if you casually read books on the fighting here, we tend to concentrate on the 47th and 48th because we feel, I suppose, they fought hard on the first battle. They're going to be overrun on the second battle, and what we forget is that this counterattack that took place, which was a very, very successful counterattack. Which will force the Germans back, almost back to their starting point, but not quite. They will continue to hold the railway embankment, and they will continue to hold the reserve trenches as well. It was the 45th and the 49th battalions who will lead the charge on the counterattack.
So there's a fantastic account of the counterattack in Ted Lynch's book, Somme Mud. He talks about the attack as being part of the 45th as they came down the slope, and some quite harrowing details. But an absolutely if we want to talk about the Aussies and how great they were as fighters, etc., this is a great example. The Australians really should be lauded here for what they did, because the same divisions that had been overrun, reassembling, charging back down the slope, pushing the Germans back, even though they were massively outnumbered, forcing those Germans back to about halfway down that slope. Just an absolutely extraordinary feat of arms that we would see numerous times, not just from Australians, of course. We saw it from Canadians, we saw it from French, we saw it from British troops, we saw it from Germans many times as well. So it was just the nature of the fighting in the First World War, and something that should not be overlooked, the idea that you would take ground and then the enemy would counterattack fairly swiftly to seize that ground back. So this concept of ground changing hands quite rapidly is really a hallmark of the fighting in the First World War.
It is indeed, and it's something that the Germans were very proud of, their counter-attacking, but of course we learn from them as they learnt from us, so it's something that we realise that if you counter-attacked very quickly, then the Germans in this case were still finding their way about, still trying to dig in, and we very quickly rolled them up and pushed them back almost to their start lines.
We're going to keep walking down the slope now, Pete, and we're going to come back to the embankment where the track meets the embankment. And very near this area during the fighting, there was a cart track that actually crossed the embankment. The ground is slightly higher here, the embankment isn't so high, and there was a cart track which was actually cut through the embankment. And that was a key spot because it was one of the spots the Germans could get through very effectively without having to scramble over the embankment. So there was a lot of heavy fighting around the cart track where that came through. So that was in the vicinity of where we are now on the railway embankment. And we're going to turn right and walk back towards where we started at the bridge in the embankment. And as we walk along this stretch, again, I really like just looking up at that embankment. It's been modernised. It's still used as a train line. Trains will still go screaming past overhead as you walk along here. But you can still see just little furrows. You can get a really great perspective of what it must have been like for the troops who were sheltering there. And like always on these battlefields, anywhere that provides protection is going to be very heavily used. And it was also in this spot while the Australians were digging into their little scrapes and little trenches that they dug in the embankment that during the early phases of the attack, they came into quite heavy field gun fire. So this is artillery fire from the Germans, who had broken through on the left, so had broken through further in front of them, were able to get field guns through that breach and actually were blasting away at the Australians from behind with these field guns. Again, that would have been a pretty horrendous place to be.
It's also one of my favourite spots because as you're looking in that bank and you can see those little divots, because that's where the 4th Pioneer Battalion were digging. That's where they were trying to dig their holes right the way through to give fields of fire for machine guns. And sadly, a lot of those holes that they dug in that embankment became their burial locations, because that's where the Germans buried them. They buried them in the holes that they'd been digging for the machine gun position. So I always look along that bank and I often wonder how many are still there, because there's an awful lot of missing from this battle as well, and not all of them were found. And whether some of the men that are missing from this battle are still on the bank on the railway embankment there.
Well, let's keep walking along that embankment, which is now on our left, heading across the ground. And of course, as each step we take, we've got to remember just how many men fought and died in this area. It's overwhelming. You can never quite comprehend exactly, how many ghosts you're walking with. But this is definitely a place on the Western Front where you're going to be walking in the footsteps of a lot of men, both Australian and British as well, and of course Germans who died in this area. And speaking of those men who were killed in this battle and in the area around it, we're going to keep walking another half a kilometre or so until we come back to that cemetery that you mentioned earlier in the walk, Pete. Now, it's one of my favourites on the Western Front. There's just something very, very moving about this cemetery. And for some reason, I have no idea why, but it's always the cemetery that I can imagine the grief of the pilgrims who came to visit their lost sons. There's just something about Dernancourt where it's a cemetery that, to me, I can very effectively visualise devastated families returning to visit the graves of their lost sons. It's just a really lovely place.
It is. I think it's. I quite like the openness of it, because the frontage. Yes, you have to climb up some steps, but there's no real wall. It's just just starts in front of you. So you climb up the steps into the cemetery, designed by Lutyens, who designed the great memorial on the Teepval Ridge, the Teepval British Memorial to the Missing. So Lutyens is one of the great architects of the cemeteries and the memorials. So it's a beautiful cemetery, and it's quite a big cemetery as well, because it was initially being used from 1915 onwards. As soon as the British moved on to the Somme battlefields, it was used as part of the casualty clearing area. So there are original burials from that period, from the Battle of the Somme, again used for casualty clearing, and then it becomes a cemetery that's going to be used for the bringing of the dead from cemeteries that are going to be closed down. So it's a concentration cemetery. So eventually it grows and grows and becomes a fairly substantial cemetery. What's interesting is not everybody is buried within the cemetery, because the civil cemetery which abuts it also has military burials in there. And I always think that's kind of slightly odd in some ways. Why would you bury people in a civil cemetery when you've got a military cemetery next to it? We'll never really know, but quite a few Australians are buried. In fact, there are an awful lot of Australians who are buried within the communal cemetery and are not, strictly speaking, in the military cemetery.
I always find it very interesting. You see this quite often on the Western Front, and we actually did a year or so ago a whole podcast on my Living History channel about the nature of cemeteries on the Western Front. So go and check that out if you haven't listened to it, because it was a fascinating discussion that you and I had, Pete. But this is an example of one of those interesting types of cemeteries where you have a civilian cemetery, a communal cemetery as they're called, because they belong to the commune, the villages in the area. And the impression I always have, Pete, when I visit them is it seems to me almost that in the early days of the war, when fighting occurred and you cleared the battlefield after a battle, it seemed to make sense that you said, well, there's already a cemetery there. There's already dead bodies in consecrated ground. It just sort of makes sense. We've got half a dozen blokes, or we've got a dozen blokes to bury. It just kind of made sense that we'll just put them in the village cemetery. But then, of course, as fighting carried on and carried on and carried on, pretty swiftly, it became obvious that the civilian cemetery was going to be way too small to accommodate the number of burials. So then you see what we have here, which is an extension, where effectively they just took the field next to the cemetery or behind the cemetery and just filled it up with military burials. So it's quite always a fascinating visit when you come to one of these communal cemeteries, which then has a military extension behind it. And it's fascinating. As you say, we don't know why that they chose to bury some men in the extension and some in the communal cemetery. Maybe it was simply the blokes felt that, maybe they were more religious, or some of the guys in the burial parties, and they felt that consecrated ground was where they should be laid rather than just in a field. We'll never actually know, but again, the great tapestry of mystery that comes from exploring these military cemeteries. I absolutely love it.
I do. It's one of my favourite subjects. And I think one of the odder aspects of this is that a couple of the guys that are in, or quite a few of the guys that are in there, are not from the early days of the fighting. They're actually from the fighting of this period we're talking about, where there was a well-established military cemetery. So why on earth would you then not bury them in that cemetery? As you said, we'll never know. And I think that's one of the great stories of the Western Front, really, is that you will never know the answer to some of these quandaries, but it's great to have a think about it and try and work it out.
Just to give some indication of the numbers we're talking about here, there's 127 soldiers buried in the communal cemetery, in the civilian cemetery, and then there's 2,162 in the military extension. So that shows the scale of the death and destruction that would come afterwards. And it's always the case. If you always find a handful of burials in the communal cemetery, and then an absolutely massive extension beside it. It's a really lovely place to visit, especially in the afternoon light. Dernancourt Cemetery is a really lovely place to be. It sounds like an odd choice of words, but I always find a very strong connection with both the history and the men who are buried there, and I always really enjoy visiting cemeteries to pay my respects to them. Any other things you want to add about this cemetery, Pete? It's a really interesting spot.
Well, just to give the number of Australians, there are 378 Australians buried within the cemetery itself. I just want to talk a little bit about the village, and just because we can see the village, we can look back towards the village. Well, actually, we can't quite see it. It's over the embankment. Population, about 500 people living in the village now. I suspect, as in most of these villages, it would have been a greater population before the First World War and probably just after the First World War as the village was rebuilt. And the village has been completely rebuilt. It's exactly the same footprint. And that's one of the things that we should stress as well, is that all the roads we've been walking, the tracks we've been walking, the railway embankment, it's not changed. The great thing about this battlefield, everything is exactly where it was during the fighting, and that was destroyed has been put back.
Well, that's really the battlefield of Dernancourt, Pete. It's a really good spot. It's one of my favourites, in spite of the fact, as you say, we don't often visit it on a tour because it doesn't quite fit in. Most people don't know about it. It's just one of those ones in an odd place that doesn't quite fit with a regular tour of the battlefields. But I would say to everyone listening that go and check it out. It's an extraordinary place. And a couple of hours spent walking in the footsteps of the Aussies and the Germans is quite a remarkable experience on the battlefields.
The final thing I should just add is that, like a lot of these villages now, they're very proud of what happened within their village, and I'm proud of the Australian effort to try and hold the village and to retake it from the Germans. And so we now have explanatory panels close to the Marri, the town hall, or the village hall, should I perhaps say. And and it's always worthwhile just going to have a look, and you sometimes get an insight into how the French view what went on in this area. The other thing that's not to everybody's taste, I have to say, is that there are murals now painted on the railway bridge. So the railway bridge is one of perhaps the key points of the battlefield, and we have these murals. One is of a nurse, and there are pictures of soldiers. And it's something the French have started doing, is adding murals to the battlefield. As I say, not to everybody's taste, but I think it's just nice that they feel like they want to enhance your experience in some way.
It's very well said, Pete. We do owe a great debt of gratitude to the French and how they remember the soldiers who fought and died there, and indeed the Belgians across the border. We should not forget about our friends in Belgium as well. It's one of the most rewarding aspects of visiting the battlefields are those interactions with the local people. So you don't need to speak French. It helps if you do, but even if you don't, it's worthwhile always just having a chat to the locals and maybe a cold beer in one of their pubs and just finding out what they know about the battlefields. One of the most rewarding aspects of visiting this area. Pete, thank you so much. I always love, mate. I learned so much walking in the footsteps of the Anzacs on these virtual tours. So just thank you so much for your contribution. It's always really great to catch up with you and walk this ground.
A pleasure, mate. Really enjoyed it.
Well, everyone, that was the Battle of Dernancourt, a great battlefield in the Somme region. We'll be back next week. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget, subscribe to the podcast. Tell your friends. Please leave us a review, particularly on Apple Podcasts, because the more people that know about it, the more good content we can bring you. It's something we love doing. Until next week, thank you for joining us.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 months for just $44.95 with free shipping.
At Leidos, a brilliant mind is smart, but a brilliant team is smarter. A ship that finds enemy subs is smart, but an autonomous fleet, that's smarter. Defending against cyber attacks? Smart. Stopping attacks before they start? Smarter. And using AI tools is smart, but integrating trusted mission AI into your technology is smarter. We're not just making technology solutions in national security and health. We're making smart smarter. Leidos.